It sounds like there are two versions of the king in the field analogy. Can we have clarification? Sure. There are two versions of the king in the field analogy. The more famous one and the less famous one. And the difference between the two is the more famous one has been in print for close to 180 years. And the less famous one was actually printed just in the last 25 or 30 years, or 35 years. And this complexity emerges in the Rebbe's Maimorim, the edited Maimorim of the Rebbe on Melech Basada. First of all, there's a Maimor from the Rebbe, Anila Doidi Tovshan Chavov, and there's also a Maimor Anila Doidi Tovshan Lamed Beis, which makes this point to a lesser extent, which is safe from Maimor Maluk at the old ones, Chelik Dalid. It begins on page Shin Samach Gimel, but you want to read page Shin Samach Hey in the text near footnote 16, where the Rebbe is mitzayin to Maimori Ad Marzoken Alateira, Pashas Alateira, Cheli Beis, which begins on page Tov Tov Chav Hey. Let me tell you the story. The classic situation of the king in the field analogies on Likutei Torah in Pashas Re'eh, which happens to be this week's Pasha. Pashas Re'eh, as I'm talking to you now, it's Thursday of Pashas Re'eh, Chol Gimel Menachem Tavshin Pei Gimel. This question, by the way, was asked a year ago, and I delayed answering it till now because I wanted to answer it in season. And in that Maimer, the Rebbe gives the example of there being three arenas. There's a city, there's a field, and there's a desert. The city is representative of tzaddikim, or neshamas in Gan Eden. The field is a place of people in this world who are in the madrega of Beinani. And the desert is the place for the people who are less than madrega of Beinani that need to do tshuva. And the way the mashal goes, the way the analogy goes, is the king visits the field. And he meets the people who live in the field. Mystically, the people living in the field in madrega is Beinani. The people in the desert are not allowed into the field to see the king unless they first do tshuva. Which is why, if you know the Chabad history, you know that Hasidim were not into Melech Basada. The Rabbi were not into Melech Basada. Because the king in the field is almost a depressing marshal, traditionally. Because the king in the field says that the king visits a handful of really righteous people. They have a Yetzer Hara, but they've never listened to the Yetzer Hara. They're in Madregas Benyani. All the people who are lower than Madregas Benyani are in the desert and not in the field. They cannot greet the king. The king doesn't come out to see them. He's not friendly and jovial and intimate with them, and not able to follow the king back into the palace and so on. Which is why I heard from my mashpiyim growing up that when mashpiyim would teach the Maimah Anila Doidi, they would start from Perek Beis, from Uvikashta Misham. They would assume that we're not Beinyanim and we're not in the field, and they would talk about the idea that if you do an Aveda, you have to look for the tshuva in the place of the Aveda. Uvikashta Misham. Sham goes on Klipa, and in Sham you're going to find Elakus. If you learn the Maimah Anila Doidi, you'll see that this is written there, even though in our generation we're so king in the field centric that we don't see it. So the classic version of the king in the field leaves most of us away from the king, because the king is visiting only the field people, which is Beinyan. Now, there's a Maimah from Alter Rebbe. Well, there's another Maimah from Alter Rebbe, but the second Maimah from Alter Rebbe that Tzemach Tzedek didn't publish in the Likutei Torah, it was printed by our Rebbe in the last 40 years or 35 years. And there he brings the same mashal with a tiny change. And this is the Maimah of the Alter Rebbe. I think there's a newer print of this, but this is the old print. That he's speaking about the king in the field. And he says, Bria Yetzira Asiya, which are Elamis Nefradim. And he says together, V'nikra Sode Umidbar. He puts the field and desert in one sentence. Like a king who travels in the desert. He And in this Maimer, he argues that the metaphor of the king in the field is not about the deservedness of the people. It's about the disposition of the king. In other words, in the Likutei Torah, the king in the field, the king is visiting the field. So if you deserve to be in the field, you meet the king. You don't deserve to be in the field, you don't meet the king. which leaves the desert people, which is all of us who are in Madrega of Tshuva, out of the analogy. But if you flip the analogy around, and instead of saying that the king in the field means he's visiting the people of the field, but the king is out of his place of comfort. The king is not where he's meant to be. And when a king is taken out of his environment, he becomes warmer and more friendly and less formal than when he is in the confines of his regular place. So now it doesn't matter how deserving you are, because it isn't about the king coming to you because you're deserving. It's the king being available because the king is out of sorts. And all of a sudden, whether the king is in the field or the king in the desert makes no difference, because it's not about how deserving we are. It's when the king is out of his regular element, he's automatically warmer and more friendly. That's a simple fact. So the Alter Rebbe said the Maimer twice, the mashal twice. But in one, he focused on the people, and the king coming to the field because of the field people, which excludes the desert people. And in the other, it's because the king is, so to speak, lost. And in the latter version versus the former version, when the focus is on the king being out of his place, rather than the king visiting the people who deserve him, the people in the desert are just as qualified to greet the king. And the result of this is a whole change of our sentiment towards the mashal of Malach Basada, and a whole change of attitude towards Elul. When we understand that the king in the field analogy is not only about the king visiting the field, but the king being in the wrong place, which is what we call in our culture Shchinta Begalus. Hashem destroyed the Beis Hamikdash. The Gemara says in Berachos, Oy loy, Oy li, shecharafti es beisi, v'igleis es beinim es elam. When we go into Golus, Hashem goes into Golus. And when Hashem is in Golus, he's not as formal, he's not revealed in a more structured and more orderly and a more focused way. But he's also much more, I hate to use these words, by the Eibush than relaxed, less judging, more available in an informal way. And this latter mashal, which of course the Rebbe knew about because the Rebbe had access to the Ksavim. And when the Rebbe said Maimorim, he was aware of this alternative version of the king in the field analogy, which have Maimorim Dal Rebbe. And by the way, there's in the footnote of the Mugadik Maimorim references to the previous Rebbe also seems to be suggesting the alternative version of the king in the field. So the Rebbe made the king in the field analogy an unconditional expression of Hashem's connection to Jewish people, not a conditional one. Although in the Likutei Torah the king in the field is about deserving being in the field with the king, the second mashal of the king in the field has to do with Golus. The king, when he's away from his place, is just nicer and warmer and more readily available. And Melech Basada means, no matter where we are, the king is Makabel Kulam Perim Sheichakes, Makabel Kulam Perim Sevi Yafis, Makabel Kulam Mara Panim Sheichis Lekulam, Makabel Kulam Sevi Panim Yafis, and the Chelim Verashoyim Kol Misha Reitzet to come and talk to the king and all that is an unconditional phenomenon of the king in the field. And on this basis, that I've made the king in the field something which is so positive that there's no person to whom it doesn't speak. Like the famous story with the Meir Abu Chatzira, Olav Shalom, that he went to one of his conferences where he talked about his diet, macrobiotics, I think it's called. And the Rebbe told him to say the king in the field. And he was talking to a bunch of people. Most of them were not Jewish. They certainly were not in the right frame of mind, and he didn't come to give a Shir Chassidus. So he did his talk on diet, and every few minutes he would stop and say, ladies and gentlemen, I need you to know that the king is in the field. And he went back to his talk. He didn't explain it. He just stated the king is in the field. And when he was done, the people were so taken by this disconnected phrase, Oisius Perchis. I said, this idea, I don't know what the king in the field is all about, but it's a cool idea. It's a radical idea. It's a groovy idea, as they used to say in the old hippie days. And it moved people. And the Rebbe said 1,000,000 times, 1,000 times, 100,000 times, 10,000 times, the king is in the field, and the king is in the field in an unconditional way. And we have to approach the king. Not for him, for us. It's right, and it's good, and it's righteous. And it makes us more deserving of our relationship with the king. It makes it more complicated. But this is our role, to go from being undeserving underlings to being a little bit deserving underlings, and still to remind the Eibush that we want to be like peasants, like simple people. The king embraces unconditionally. And I want to wish all of us a ksiva and a chsima teva l'shon teva mesukah b'teva nirva nigla. And a good chedesh, a sochatik chedesh shalom.